Hi, and welcome back to the Nuremberg box project. I am back to complete the box. I wasn't intending to do that originally because I felt it was just going to be a repetition of what I had already done. But I heard from quite a number of you that wanted to see the finished project. So I think I've come up with a couple of ideas that you're going to like. And the first one is going to be doing a little bit of engraving onto the top cover plate of the box. Now, I have to caution you right off the bat, if you're interested in engraving, and especially if you're interested in learning how to do it correctly, I strongly recommend that you go find some videos from professional engravers. This process is called hammer engraving, and it's used a lot for carving decorative work on guns and that sort of thing. I am in no way a professional engraver, and I certainly have not put in the time, nor do I have the time left to cut the miles and miles of engraving lines that it must take to become really proficient at this. The idea here is just to give you a basic introduction of and a little bit of a heads up on what I've learned over the years and, just how to get started. I do all my engraving with one type of graver, and it's basically just a square bar that has one corner sharpened into a cutting edge. The actual cutting edge is a small triangle that you see at the front of the tool. I've ground away the top edge just to make that face as small as possible to make it easier to sharpen. Even though this is a very simple tool, it's incredibly versatile and it will produce all the dimensions of lines that you need for any engraving. There are a lot of specialized engravers, of course, that will make certain parts of the job a lot easier, but essentially this one tool will do it all. Unfortunately, the thing that makes this tool so versatile is also what makes it so hard to master. I find that one of the hardest things to do with a graver is to produce a very thin, uniform line, whether it's a straight line or a curved line. Producing a line that is of uniform width is an extremely hard thing to do with a graver. And the reason that line is so hard to achieve is because you have to be able to hold a graver at a consistent angle through the entire cut. You can't allow the chisel to cut any deeper or shallower at any point, and you can't allow the chisel to roll from one side to the other. If you allow the chisel to roll during the cut, one edge of the line is going to be cut a little bit deeper and therefore thicker than the other side. So even though your tip may be following the line exactly, you're going to be leaving a wavy furrow in behind the line. And of course, the eye is really adept at picking up that kind of variation. On the other hand, a line that seems more complicated is actually, in theory at least, the simplest to cut. It's the one that starts off as a thin line and then it just gradually thickens out as the cutting goes on. This is seen a lot in curved lines and scrolls and that sort of thing. This is just done by allowing the graver to lean over to one side more and more and allowing that face to dig into the plate deeper and deeper the further along you go. So even though this curved line is a really fun thing to play around with on a practice plate, and by doing so it's pretty easy to give yourself the idea that you're getting good at this. When you see the whole thing in a completed pattern and you start noticing all the variances in the lines that should be all the same, but you just can't get them there, that's when you start to understand and really begin to respect the amount of time commitment that it takes to really become good at this. Here you see a mock-up of the working end of the graver, and by comparison I have the actual graver sitting next to it. The reason I've done this is because there's one aspect to sharpening this tool that is so important and yet it's so microscopic. The only way you can see it is blown up to this size. The way the graver is set up is pretty straightforward, of course. The two faces that meet at the cutting edge at the point are essentially 90 degrees because those are the two sides of the square, and the front face is ground to about 45 degrees to the bottom edge of the graver. Here I flip the graver over and you're looking at the bottom edge of the tool, and at the very tip of the cutting edge you see a small secondary bevel that's been honed in. And believe it or not, without this secondary bevel, this graver will not work properly. And that is something that I misunderstood for years. I would put in this secondary bevel, but I would let it get to a size where it actually became the base angle of the graver, not a secondary bevel, and any combination you could think of. I just didn't understand how tiny this thing had to be. And that's the whole reason I mocked up this tool. I mean, you're looking at a graver that's made out of a 2-inch block of wood, but this little tiny bevel is barely 3/16 of an inch long. So the actual graver that I'm using is a little under 3/8 of an inch square. So, that bevel is barely a 32nd of an inch. It's just, even under magnification, it's really hard to see, but it's so important. I do all my sharpening with these cheap diamond hones that are available just about anywhere. Harbor Freight carries them. If you're in Canada, Princess Auto carries them. A lot of hardware stores are starting to carry them now. They usually are glued to a colorful backing that differentiates the different grits. But the actual hones last a long time, but the glue that's holding the plate to the backing falls away pretty quickly. So that's what I have here. I'm just using the plate. If you're grinding the cutting edge on a new graver, you need to pick two sides of the forging that are going to become the bottom of the tool. I've highlighted all of the cutting edges here in blue. So what you're looking at now is the bottom of the tool. When I turn it over, you'll see the front face of the tool, and that's also considered a cutting edge. The red is just to differentiate easily between the top and the bottom of the tool. The first thing that needs to be done when you're sharpening a graver for the first time is to hone all of the cutting edges until they are dead flat. It's extremely important when you're sharpening the graver that you are able to register the cutting edges on a very, very flat surface, so there's no crowning or anything like that that's going to happen. It's important that all of the surfaces remain very flat. If you lose that flatness, you have to go back to the grinder to reinstate it, and then come back and hone those edges again. But the front face and the two bottom faces of the graver all need to stay flat, and the main backbone, if you want to call it that, of the graver, the spine of the cutting edge, always needs to be very, very flat. And the only way to maintain that is to always hone the entire face of the two bottom edges. If you start taking shortcuts and just hone the last 1/4 inch or something, it will work for a couple of times, but eventually the bottom of the cutting tool is going to start developing a curve, and you're looking at a lot more grinding and a lot more work to get that back. So just get into the habit of always honing the entire face and keep that bottom edge of the graver as a perfect straight line. The last step of sharpening the graver for the first time is to hone in that secondary bevel that I was talking about earlier. I want to emphasize that this is only done when you need to reestablish that secondary bevel. It is not done every time you need to sharpen the tool. With repeated sharpenings, the front face will be ground back, and this bevel will start to disappear. When it becomes too short, then you need to reestablish that bevel. My method for honing in this bevel is to support the tip of the tool on the edge of a board or a workbench or whatever you have, and then rotate the tool slightly, about 20 degrees or so, to one side, and then lay the hone flat on the edge and just run it back and forth a few times. It really doesn't take much. And then rotate the tool back the other way and do the same thing. It'll take a little bit of experimenting to get the right angles. What you're looking for is that little equilateral triangle right at the very, very tip that's just barely visible. But once you get the angles right, it's a very repeatable thing. And again, this is only done when you need to reestablish that bevel. It's not done every time you sharpen the tool. I'm going to be doing all my work today on this makeshift engraver's vise. It's just a piece of plywood that's been attached to a piece of square pipe. I'm going to be able to attach the work to the surface of this, and because it's just freestanding, I'm going to be able to spin it around, 360 degrees to get at whatever section of the engraving that I need to get to. Normally, engravers have a very specific vise that clamps onto the work, and it spins on a ball that's, very accurate. It also allows them to angle the work if they need to and all that kind of stuff. But for what I do, this kind of a setup works fine, and I usually just jerry rig something based on what I'm doing. If it's small enough, you can put it in your vise and be able to walk around it and just reposition it every once in a while. But this actually worked pretty well. I was surprised. It would, the hammer blows are so light that it didn't shift around or anything. So this, just about anything will work. The important thing is it needs to be held at a good height, so you're not hunched over working or throwing your back out or anything like that. And it's easy to move around. So when you need to get to a part of a carving that's a little tougher, you just spin it until it works. And I just use carbon paper to transfer the pattern to the surface of the plate. This is actually not the design that I'm going to be using on the finished box. This is one that I screwed up earlier, and then I realized I need to move the keyhole over slightly, so I had to modify, that design, and I may go into that later. But basically, it's the same design, just a little bit different. I'm just avoiding the areas that are a little too rough to be shown in public. So this is an attempt to clean up some of this work, give you an idea how it goes. Here you can see the start of the chip forming in front of the cutting edge. When the cutting edge is really sharp, the chip comes up as right away, and it comes into a very nice smooth scroll. Once the tool begins to dull a little bit, you'll see that chip start to compress a little bit more. It'll still come off the face, of course, but you're going to start noticing that you're hammering a little bit harder, and the chip isn't quite as smooth in terms of the scroll shape as it was. At that point, it's really important to go back and hone up the front face and the two sides of the cutting edges. So, it's really important to keep the front cutting tip very, very sharp. It's really important to take the time to go back and hone the cutting edge the minute you notice any kind of a change in the cutting ability of the engraver. Any handheld cutting tool is going to follow the path of least resistance. If you have a very sharp tool, that path of least resistance is going to be directly in front of the cutting edge. If you let that edge get dull, one side may be a little duller than the other, so the chip is going to compress on that side, and it's going to force the chisel or the graver offline, because it's going to, the one side is going to cut a little more, so it's going to want to drift in that direction. At that point, you're going to start messing up your lines. You may have to start angling the chisel to start correcting it. It's basically just going to mess up your work, and depending on how far you are into the engraving, it could really ruin hours and hours of work. And that's essentially what happened on this plate. I was forcing the chisel a little too much, trying to get a few more inches out of the cutting edge, and I wound up with a couple of flat sides to curved lines and that kind of thing, because the chisel was drifting and I just didn't realize it. And as you know, I make all my own tools, and I do everything with spring steel, but I have to say that when it comes to engraving, especially something large like this, where there's several feet of engraving involved in this project, you really start to see the limitations of using a lesser quality steel, because that little tiny microscopic point is what takes all the punishment, and that fine cutting edge disappears fairly quickly. So even though I'm just doing one section here, you'll see me sharpening the tool a couple of times, to get the thing done. So if you plan on doing a lot of this, it's really going to be beneficial to go ahead and purchase like a 1095 or something like that will hold up a lot better. And I think a lot of engravers are also just making their tools out of high-speed steel tool bits and mounting them into wooden handles, which seems to work pretty well. So, but this worked. I don't really have any complaints. It took me longer, obviously, than it would have if I had a better quality tool, but still, it still fills the bill. It was cheap, easy to make, and for the amount of engraving that I do, I didn't mind the extra bit of sharpening, and it'll be long forgotten in 2 or 3 years when I get to do another bit of engraving. So, so at this point, the video is basically done. The next 20 minutes, I'm going to be hammering away on this to complete this one portion of the engraving. The engraving actually consists of 8 of these elements. So, if you want to see the whole thing engraved, just watch this next section, 7 more times. And this is also in real time. I haven't edited anything out the way I normally do to save time. This, I'm obviously not reheating anything or anything like that. So I just let the video play out. Every once in a while, you'll see me rest my hammer down on the plate. And if you're wondering why that is, I need to do that to be able to see that the area that I'm working on is actually showing up on camera. So the screen that I'm looking at is so tiny, it's really hard to tell what you're doing. So I do stuff like that to help me pinpoint where I'm working. Normally that stuff gets edited out, but for this next section, I'm not going to bother. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. If you have any questions, you can contact me by using the email address that I have shown here. If you like the channel and the work that I'm doing, please consider becoming a patron. Every dollar you contribute will bring me one step closer to being able to produce videos full-time.